Hey guys, welcome back to the Timber Forge, and today I'm going to be doing a Let's Code video on creating a multiplayer friendly throwable lightsaber inside of Minecraft using datapacks. Okay, so if you do not care about the series itself and you just want to see how I created the lightsaber, skip to this timestamp on the screen. But if you do care about the series itself, stick around for a few more seconds. So for this video, I'm going to be trying a new style, and instead of making the data pack from the beginning and explaining as I go, I pre-make the data pack and then I uncomment and explain each section of commands and show what they do incrementally. Hopefully this will be more engaging and concise. Comment which style you prefer after watching both this video and my last Let's Code video. Right now I'm thinking that I will do this pre-make and uncommenting method for more advanced packs, because intermediates and some beginners do not need me to explain the thought process behind every single execute command as I write it. For simpler Let's Code videos, I may do the explaining as I go to explain slower and to explain the entire thought process. Leave any suggestions or feedback you have in the comment section below. Also, you can leave suggestions for future things to make in a Let's Code video. Alright, so before we get into creating any files or commands, I'm first going to show you what I'm starting with. I'm starting with a resource pack because in my Let's Code series I don't create the resource pack with you guys because it's not that fun to watch modeling. But right now I have a carrot on a stick which has the custom model data value of 41, and that gives me a lightsaber like this. And when I use a custom model data value of 4, I get this animated model. I used method 2 from my animated model video. If you didn't see that, or you don't know how to create animated models, or if you don't know how to create models at all, make sure you go check out those videos before watching this, or you could just watch it and find out how to make models later on. So the first thing that I do is I go to /give, and this is where I'm going to create the actual give command for the lightsaber. Since I want it to work on a right click, I'm going to have to use a carrot on a stick in order to be able to detect the right click. You could also use a warped fungus on a stick, but I'm just going to use a carrot on a stick because that's what I normally use. So I'm going to go here and choose carrot on a stick. And then I'm going to set the name to lightsaber, and this is just an example. I'll show you my full actual command later on, because remember I'm going to be showing you the commands that I already have. But I basically configure everything in here, and I make sure to set it to red, and I also set italic to false. And some stuff I also add, you could add lore if you want. I don't want any damage. I set it to unbreakable since it's a lightsaber. And count, you could just leave that blank. It defaults to 1 anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And custom model data for the actual swinging lightsaber, not the mid-air thrown lightsaber. My value for custom model data is 41. And custom tags, make sure you use a custom tag in order to identify it. So I put like LC Lightsaber. And if you remember, item tags need to have :1b afterwards in order to actually work. And I also added some modifiers here. So I added attribute modifiers, and I added more for attack damage, and you can just set this to whatever you want and just leave these as they are, and it should just work fine. And after you configure it to whatever you want, this doesn't only apply to lightsabers, this applies to any other custom item. Make sure you check out my custom item series if this doesn't look familiar to you. But once I created that, I went over. So this is a give command which says give @s, so that's just whoever's running this function. This is in a new MC function. I'm assuming that you already know how to create a basic MC function. It's basically a renamed text file. And so give the current entity, which is whoever runs the function, a carrot on a stick with the display name of lightsaber with the color of red that is not italic. Hide flag 6 basically just means it hides the fact that it's unbreakable. And repair cost 100, this is basically to prevent you from putting enchantments onto it because it's a lightsaber and it doesn't need it. And I set it to unbreakable. This is the custom model data to give it the actual model. LC Lightsaber is a custom tag which is used later on to detect if the player is holding the custom lightsaber. Then I added the attribute modifiers for attack damage and for attack speed. That's how fast you could swing. For example, an axe has a really low attack speed because if you swing it has to like recharge and pull it back up. And those are the only ones that I modified. Attack damage I set it to 10, and attack speed I set it to 0.1. And the values are kind of weird, but you could just test it and compare between stuff that's fast like a hoe and stuff that's really slow like an axe. So now once I added that function, when I go in game, you'll notice that if I reload and I do the function, so /function, and the only one that's actually functioning right now, you could ignore the other ones because I didn't explain those yet, is lightsaber give. And when I run that, I actually get my lightsaber, which as you can see, it doesn't say unbreakable underneath because I hid the actual tooltip for the unbreakable by using the hide flags tag. And now it's just a normal lightsaber. Now if I get a mob like a husk, for example, you'll notice that the attribute modifier for damage did actually work because it like two-shots the husk. So now just for future references, I'm just going to put the function inside of here. And I'm just going to put that inside of here so that I can just hit this button anytime I need a new lightsaber. And something really quick, I'm going to change this to give at P just so it gives me the lightsaber. Now let's move on to the next section. What we want to do is actually use this carrot on a stick, which this item actually is, as you can see in the tooltips. This is a carrot on a stick, and I use it to be able to detect right clicks. So what I do is I go over to load.mz function, and if you don't know how to create load.mz function, make sure you check out my datapack tutorial, my original tutorial on how to make a datapack. But basically this function automatically loads with the game anytime you reload the datapack. So first of all, I just have a say command here that just says that the datapack successfully loaded. And now I'm going to create the scoreboard. This is scoreboard objectives add, which means I'm making a new scoreboard. And I'm calling it LCRC, that just stands for let's code right click. Then I'm making it of type Minecraft.used carrot on a stick. So anytime I right click, it will increase the scoreboard by 1. I don't only want to have a carrot on a stick detection because I want to make sure that the carrot on a stick being used is specifically a lightsaber carrot on a stick. So what I'm doing is I'm adding another one. This is scoreboard objectives add LC throw. This is just let's code throw. This is when I detect that I threw a lightsaber specifically, and it's type dummy, which means that it can only be modified by commands. So when I save those, then I should have 2 separate scoreboard objectives. Now if I go into main.mc function, I want to actually make it do something. So right now, if I just show you what it does, and I do scoreboard objective set display sidebar LCRC, you'll notice anytime I click, it increases by 1. But the issue is that I want to make sure that it resets, because if I don't make it reset, if you use a normal carrot on a stick and click, then it's going to increase your right click. And then when you switch to a lightsaber, it's going to throw automatically because it thinks that your right click is already up. So you have to separate the right click from normal carrot on a sticks and custom carrot on a sticks. So the way that I do that is with right click detection here in combination with the lightsaber detection. So I'm doing scoreboard players set for all players who have right clicked. So this means if they have right clicked with anything, it could be a lightsaber or it could be a normal carrot on a stick. But then I also have the extra detection for NBT selected item, meaning they have to be holding a carrot on a stick that has the specific tag that we added earlier, which is LC lightsaber 1B. And if all of those are true, meaning they right clicked with the lightsaber, then it will set their LC throw to a value of 1. So now anytime their LC throw value goes to 1, then I know that they actually threw a lightsaber as opposed to any right clicking item. And now I also want to make sure that I reset the right click scoreboard anytime that they right click so that it actually resets even if they use a non-lightsaber. So now what you should see when I reload is that it resets. Anytime I click, LCRC goes up, but then it goes back down. And if I scoreboard set display, or scoreboard objective set display sidebar LC throw, you'll notice that when I click with a normal carrot on a stick, nothing happens, but when I click with a lightsaber, it actually increases, and it gets set to 1. Right now, it's not resetting because I only want to reset it after they throw the lightsaber, and we haven't set that up yet. And the way that this actual command works is I'm doing scoreboard players reset on all players who have a score of at least 1 for the right-click scoreboard, then it resets the scoreboard of right-click. So basically, if they right-click, it's going to reset. And I make sure this is at the end to make sure that it only resets after it is able to detect if they were actually right-clicking with a lightsaber specifically. So now let's go on to creating the actual throwing section for the lightsaber to make it actually throw. So now what I'm doing here is I'm executing as all players, meaning the entity of the command is changed to the player. If you don't know how execute as works, make sure you go check out my video on that. But I'm executing as all players, and I'm only running off of 1 at a time, and I'll explain that later on, but it has to do with multiplayer compatibility. And I'm executing as all players who have thrown the lightsaber. Remember, that's what LC throw means. It increases when the player has actually thrown the lightsaber. Then at the position of the player, then I will run the function lightsaber throw. So now I actually need to set up that function lightsaber throw. You could do that through VS Code up here, or you could just create a new text file. It doesn't really matter. So now in throw.mc function, you could ignore all of the commented out text. So what I have first of all is I just have a simple say command to make sure that it's working. So if I go back, what should happen is LC throw. It should start spamming this say command. As you can see, it's spamming throw, and the reason is that LC throw is still up from earlier. So if I reset scoreboard players reset at SLC throw, you'll notice that it stops spamming. And if I right click again, it's going to start saying throw again. But now we want to make sure that when we actually right click, it resets once it throws. So down here, what I have is a reset command. So scoreboard players reset at SLC throw, and I make sure to put this at the very end of the throw function to make sure that it could run through everything, and then at the end reset it so that the player only runs it once instead of spamming. So now if I test it again, what you'll notice is if I right click, it'll just say throw once. So every time I click, not sure if you can hear that, every click is just one throw. So now I'm going to go back into here, and what we want to do is summon the actual entity which will throw into the sky when the player right clicks, and I want to make sure to remove the item from their inventory so that they can't keep using it while it's thrown. So I have a simple replace item here, and this makes sure to replace the entity in their hand. So replace item entity at S means the current entity, and since we are executing as the player because that's how we ran the throw function, because we're running as and at the player, then it's going to replace the weapon of the player with air. So basically it'll just delete what you're holding. And in addition to removing it, we want to make sure that we actually summon the entity that's going to be existing and destroying the other mobs. And for that, I'm going to be using an invisible armor stand. So what I do is execute anchored eyes. That means it's going to go at the eye level of the player as opposed to throwing from the feet of the player. Then at that position, I'm going to be running a summon command, and I'm going to be summoning an armor stand at the current position of the player at the anchored eyes position. And I want to make sure it has no gravity because when the lightsaber is thrown, I don't want it to like drop to the ground right away. I want it to be a small armor stand. I made it marker 1B to make sure it doesn't have a hitbox so it doesn't like interfere with anything. And I made it invisible because I don't want the armor stand to be visible. And then I also have two entity tags here. These can be used in order to detect the entity later on. The first one is thrown saber to mark all thrown sabers. And then the second one is new. This kind of indicates that it hasn't been configured yet in order to properly rotate and everything like that. Then for armor items on its head slot, I gave it a carrot on a stick with the tag for custom model data 4, and that's what I was talking about earlier with the example of the resource pack with the spinning lightsaber. So this is the proper custom model data value for that I set up already. So now what should happen is it should delete the lightsaber from my inventory, and then it should summon a spinning lightsaber in place. So as you can see, when I right click, now there's just a floating lightsaber. But of course we don't want to just chop our heads off because that's not what we want to do. So what we want to do is when you right click, I want it to go in the direction that I was looking. So that's what we're going to set up next. But first of all, I want to make sure that I could actually clean up these lightsabers that are floating here. So I'm just going to quickly create a kill command for all entities that have the tag of thrown saber because, oh, I spelled that wrong. And I just want to make sure that I could clean it up. So as you can see, it's gone now, because the entity tag was actually attached to the armor stand earlier. So now what we want to do is first of all make sure that it actually rotates to face the direction that the player is facing. So I'm going to do that here with this command. So I'm executing, again, anchored eyes to make sure I'm at the position where the lightsaber was summoned. And then as the nearest entity, which has the tag of thrown saber, and also has the tag of new, because I want to make sure it's not a returning saber, but is a saber that hasn't been configured to rotate yet. And then I want to make sure that it's sort nearest and limit 1, just to make sure that it only acts on one lightsaber, just in case you have multiple lightsabers at the same time. And then I'm executing at the position of the current entity, which has now been set to the lightsaber. Then I rotate as the nearest player, which is going to be whoever threw it, and then run teleport at S, which is still the saber, and then to the current position, so it's not going to move. But then these two here mean rotation. This is X and Y rotation. And since we did the rotated as the nearest player, when we teleport it to the current rotation of the command, it's going to rotate so that the lightsaber's rotation matches the player's rotation. Also, I'll just enable my sounds here. It's not that important, but I added some play sounds for the didgeridoo sound and the iron golem attack, just because it kind of sounds like the hum of a lightsaber, and I just have this for the kind of whoosh of the lightsaber when you throw it. So when I enable that, it's going to play some sounds. But now what I'm going to do is actually make the lightsaber fly out in the direction that it's facing, which now is actually properly matching the player. So what I do is I'm going to have a fly MC function, and I'll show you how this is going to work. But from the throw MC function, what we now have is a lightsaber that has the tag of thrown saber and is properly rotated to the target. So now inside of the main function, what I could do is actually add a command to execute on all of those prepared lightsabers. So what I have is execute as all entities with the tag of thrown saber, and tag equals not return, which basically means it hasn't been tagged to return yet. I'll show you when we add that later on. But it basically means that the command is outgoing and not incoming. Then at the position of the current entity, which is at the position of the saber, then we will run the function lightsaber fly, and this is just another plain old MC function. So now inside of fly.mc function, I'll show you how exactly this works. First of all, I'm just going to have this say command here just to make sure that I could actually see when it's working or not. And then I'm going to have some ray casting. If you haven't seen the last Let's Code where I had a cannonball episode, where I made a cannonball ray cast in order to hit its target, basically what I do is I make it teleport forwards every frame or every tick so that it actually gets towards its target. And the reason that I'm doing it 0.1 blocks 10 times instead of 1 block at a time is that it's more accurate and it won't accidentally phase through blocks. So I'm executing at the current entity, which is the saber. Then if the block is air, then I will run a teleport command to make it go 1 block forwards based on its rotation. And the reason that I want to make sure that the block is air is that I don't really want the lightsaber to go through stuff. If you want, you could also replace air with a block tag that has a bunch of other stuff in it, so maybe you want it to go through grass, but for the sake of example, I'm keeping it as air for here. And also, I'm just going to add the didgeridoo sound just to make sure that you hear the hum of the lightsaber when it's thrown. Okay, so now let me get a lightsaber and I'll throw it. And as you can see, it goes, but it goes really far and it just keeps going forever until it hits a block. As you can see, once it hits a block, it stops because the ray casting is only working while it's in air. But now what we want to do is either when it goes too far or when it hits a block, we want it to return and start coming back to us so that the player can catch it and throw it again. So now in order to do that, we have two things that we want to detect. We want to first detect if it hits a non-air block, and we also want to detect if it goes too far. So first of all, the detecting that it hits a non-air block is pretty simple. So all I have to do is execute unless the block is air, then I will run the command to tag the current entity, which is the lightsaber, with the tag of return. And remember, return means it's going to fly back to us. And it's basically just going to be a reverse version of this going towards the player. So that's all we had to do for detecting air. But now we want to also add the function for if it throws, we want to have it come back after a certain amount of blocks. And it's actually easier to do it by time since it's moving at a constant velocity anyways, so time works just fine. So how I'm going to do that is inside of the loadMC function, I'm adding a new scoreboard, which I'm going to activate as a timer for the lightsaber. And once it hits a certain time, I'll just have it flip around and come back. So scoreboard objectives add LC for Let's Code, LC underscore airtime, which is basically the airtime of the lightsaber, and of type dummy because we want it to be a custom timer. So inside of fly, what I have is a scoreboard command, which increases the LC airtime score of the current entity, which is the lightsaber, by 1 every time that it teleports forwards. And once it gets to a certain time, I want it to add the tag of return and just come back. So as you can see, tag at s scores equals LC airtime equals 15 or more, then add return. So once it hits 15, then it will add the tag of return. And now remember, in our main.mc function, our function which actually causes the lightsaber to fly through the air is making sure that it does not have the tag of return. So as soon as the tag of return is added, it will stop flying forwards. So now if I actually show you what happens, if I reload and give myself a lightsaber, what will happen when I throw it is that it'll just stop after a certain amount of time. So as you can see, it just stopped midair because it got the tag of return and is no longer flying forwards. And if I throw it at a short distance, you'll see, well, you won't be able to see a difference, but it will have the tag of return. So now we want it to actually fly back to the player. So now in order to get it to return, what I'm basically adding is the inverse of the fly function. So I'm executing as all entities that are lightsabers that are in the air, and this time instead of not returning, we want it to be returning, so we detect for the tag equals return tag. Then at the position of the saber, we run the function for lightsaber return. And just for now, for the sake of example, I'm going to go into return.mc function, which again is just a normal function. And I'm just going to add a say command just so you can see when it's actually working. So let me get myself another lightsaber. And now when I throw it, you should actually notice that when I throw it and it stops, as soon as it stops, it starts spamming the return. So if I throw it into a block, it'll start saying return right away. As you can see, it just started saying return and it is spamming it. So we know that it's working properly. Now we want it to actually return to us, and it's pretty simple when you're doing it for single player. So all you do is the inverse of fly.mc function, but instead of teleporting just forwards, you teleport forwards while facing the player. So again, I have the 10 teleportations of 0.1 blocks forwards. So execute at the current entity, which is the returning saber, then facing the entity of the nearest player and facing their eyes, then we will run teleport the nearest player 1 block forwards. And also let me just add these sounds on the return. So now when I go into here, what you'll notice is that when I get the lightsaber and I throw it, it actually comes back to me. But now it's just flying and cutting my head off constantly, and that's not what we want. When it comes back to the player, we want the player to actually pick it up. So I'll show you how we could fix that. So inside of return.mc function, all we have to do is detect if a player is close by. So what we do is we execute, since we're making it come back towards the head just because it looks better when it comes back towards the head. So now we're going to execute negative 1.5 blocks below the position of the player, below the position of the lightsaber, because remember the actual position of the player is not at head height, it's at the player height, which is like the feet height. So we're going to execute 1.5 blocks below the height of the lightsaber, and then as any player within a distance of 0.5 blocks, and if we detect that, then we will run the function for lightsaber give to give the lightsaber back. Then we will also execute 1.5 blocks down if the player is within distance, and then run kill at S. Notice how we're not running as the player, we're just detecting if the player is there because we don't want to kill the player, we want to kill the lightsaber entity. So now what should happen, when I reload, you should notice that I pick it back up. As you can see, now I have a lightsaber. And it seems to work perfectly fine after we add the damage, but you'll notice later that it does not work for multiplayer, and I'll show you the way to fix that later on. But before I get into multiplayer functionality, let me first go over the stuff for damage. So inside of VS Code, what I have here is 2 commands. I have one for undead mobs and one for not undead mobs. And so what I'm doing is I'm executing at the position of the current entity, which is again the flying lightsaber, and then as the entity, and I have type here equals hashtag lightsaber::not-mob. But basically it's a group of entities, and I'll show you how this actually works. But basically it's a group of non-mob entities that I don't want to detect for. And then type equals exclamation mark for not undead. If they're not undead and not a mob, and they're within 2 blocks of the lightsaber, then I will run effect give at S instant damage. And if it is undead, so that's what I have here, type equals hashtag lightsaber undead. This means the group of mobs that is called undead in my lightsaber data pack. Then it will run the effect for instant health. Now I'll show you the actual tags. So if I go into my data pack, data, lightsaber, tags, entity types, I have not mob and I have undead. So instead of not mob, I have stuff like item frames or area effect clouds, or for now I have players inside of them because I don't want it to actually work on the player, because then it'll just hurt the player when he throws it in single player. And I also have this undead file which lists all the undead mobs. And the reason that I want to give instant health to undead mobs as opposed to damage is because damage heals mobs and health hurts the undead mobs. So now I have stuff that should hurt basically any entity in the game that has health. So I have that in both the fly MC function, and I've also copied it into the return MC function because I want to make sure that it could actually do the damage properly. Now if I reload and I summon some husks, which are undead, and let's say some creepers, which are not undead, and I throw it, it should damage all of them. As you can see, it's actually doing damage to all of them. And of course, you could actually configure the damage based on the value of the effect inside of the command. So now this works perfectly fine as a lightsaber in single player. However, the only issue is that it won't work in multiplayer, because the way that this returns is it returns to the nearest player. So if I throw this at another player, instead of it hitting the player and coming back to me, the other player is just going to pick up my lightsaber. So right now it's working fine in single player, and before I go to the multiplayer section to show you how it works, I first want to point out that the multiplayer compatibility section is kind of an advanced thing in terms of the execute commands that I use. So just be careful of that. So if you get kind of confused there, just know that it's not the most simple execute commands that I've ever done before. So before I show you the actual commands for the multiplayer functionality, I'm first going to try to explain it. So how it's going to work normally, or in single player mode, how we have it right now, is when Steve throws his lightsaber towards the creeper, first of all, it's not going to do, or let's say the creeper's another player, okay? So let's say Steve throws it to creeper player. Right now, first of all, it doesn't do damage, so it's not going to damage Steve, but it's also not going to damage the creeper. If we did make it do damage, it would damage Steve and it would damage the creeper, but also the creeper would just pick up Steve's lightsaber because his lightsaber doesn't know the difference between Steve and the creeper. So what we have to do is make sure that Steve and the lightsaber are both linked together. So what we do is when they throw, first of all, I limit to 1 throw per tick so that I could assign individual IDs. So in tick number 1, so let's say this is tick 1, in tick 1, Steve is going to have an ID value of 0, and the lightsaber that he summons will also have a matching ID value of 0. And every tick that goes by that a lightsaber is in play, it's going to increase. So because I only allow 1 throw per tick, and that's what was important about the limit equals 1 inside of the throw MC function, we only allow 1 player to throw at a time, so then his ID value will be 0, and every tick all IDs increase. So now in tick 2, what happens is, first of all, the creeper throws, so he will have a value of 0, and his lightsaber will have a value of 0. But now, this is on tick 2 for the Steve, so now his value is going to go to 1, and his value is going to go to 1 too. Which means, now we have individual IDs. We could see that the creeper's lightsaber matches the creeper's ID, and Steve's lightsaber matches Steve's ID, and this is going to continue on, so we get 2, 2, we get 1, 1. And as you can see, as it keeps increasing, Steve's lightsaber is always going to have a different ID from the creeper's lightsaber, so now we actually have a way of differentiating between the two lightsabers and the two players, basically. And we could see that all of the creeper's scores and the creeper's lightsaber scores are going to be matching. So that means what we could do is just tell the lightsabers to only do damage to players that have a non-matching score. So now we have an actual way for it to be multiplayer friendly. And what we could do is right now we're just having it return to the nearest player, but instead of having it return to the nearest player, we could have it return to the nearest player that has a matching ID. So for example, in tick 3 of Steve's lightsaber throw, it'll only return to entities that have a ID score of 2. So it won't return to the creeper because his score is 1. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, hopefully you'll be able to understand it when I add the actual commands. Alrighty, so now let's get to converting our single player lightsaber into a multiplayer lightsaber. So the first thing that I want to do is go into load.mc function and set up the scoreboard that I'm going to be using for the ID. So scoreboard objectives add LCID type dummy, of course. And then inside of main, what I'm going to do is add something that will increase all of the IDs. So scoreboard players add for all entities that already have a score of 1, then increase LCID by 1, because there's no point in increasing it for random entities that don't need an ID. And what I'm going to do here is reset the scoreboard LCID score for any players if there are no more thrown sabers, because if there are no thrown sabers, the IDs don't need to exist. So execute unless entity type of armor stand and has a tag of thrown saber, run scoreboard players reset all players LCID. Now inside of throw.mc function, there are a few things to change here. So first of all, what I want to do is make sure to activate the player's ID if he doesn't already have ID. So execute unless the score of the current player for LCID is 1 or more, meaning he doesn't actually have a score yet because it was either reset or he never threw a lightsaber. Then run scoreboard player set the current entity, which is still the throwing player. and then set the score for LCID to 1. And once it's set to 1, then this function will start to increase it every single tick. So then it will set it to 1 if he doesn't already have an ID. But if the player has an ID, I want to make sure I keep the ID and I don't give him a new one to make sure that all of his new lightsabers, if he wants to throw multiple lightsabers out, actually work. So now let's go down here. When we summon the lightsaber, the new lightsaber, I also want to make sure that its ID matches. So execute anchored eyes because I want to go at the level that the lightsaber is thrown. And then as the nearest entity, so the nearest one thrown saber that is new, meaning it wasn't rotated yet, then I want to run the scoreboard player's operation at S, which is the actual lightsaber that was thrown, and then LCID equals, which means I want to set this ID to match the player's ID. So basically, I'm just matching the freshly thrown lightsaber's ID to the player's ID. And so once that happens, the lightsaber's ID should actually match. And now in fly.mc function, I think the only thing to change here is the damage. So right now what I have is it damages not mobs and it damages undead mobs. But I also want it to damage players. And I'm going to have something separate here to make sure I could detect correct player by detecting the score. So execute at the current entity, which is the lightsaber. And then as all players within 2 blocks, so if it's within range of being hit by the lightsaber, then unless the score of the current player, LCID, matches the lightsaber. So unless the score matches the lightsaber, because that would mean it's the owner and we don't want the owner to be able to cut himself with his own lightsaber, then I will run at the position of the player and then run effect give instant damage. So basically it gives instant damage to players whose scores are not matching the owner's scores. And then now inside of return, this is where we have some more changes. But first of all, I'm just going to enable the same multiplayer damage that we had earlier. And we also have stuff to change for the return because earlier we made it return to the nearest player and that is definitely not what we want for multiplayer. So let me comment these out because we don't want that to be there for multiplayer. And now I'm going to activate these new commands which basically work in the same way. They just have more detections to make sure that it only returns to the proper player who is the actual owner of the lightsaber. So how it works, let's just focus on one of these for now. Is execute at S as all players, which means it's just executing as all players, every single player. But then it narrows it down. So if score at S, since it's activating as a player, then LCID has to match the lightsaber. So what it does is it activates as all players that exist, and then it narrows it down to the one player that has a matching ID, and then facing entity at S, and by the time it gets to this section, it has narrowed it down to only the owner. And then so it's facing the owner now, and then facing their eyes, run teleport at E, which is the type of the thrown saber. And I can't use at S here because I overrode at S to get the detection for the player. So now I'm just going to do run TP the nearest lightsaber, which is going to be itself because it's still running at its own at the lightsaber's position. So it's running as the lightsaber and teleporting it 0.1 blocks forwards. And so now what it should do is face the owner and teleport towards it. And then I also have different commands for the multiplayer return to make sure that only the owner can pick it up. So let me remove these old pickup commands and replace it with the new ones. So I'm executing at the position of the lightsaber, 1.5 blocks down to make sure it's detecting for the player at the proper coordinates. And then as all players within the proper distance, and then position 1.5 blocks back up because I want to go back to the lightsaber position because what it's doing is it's basically like this. Let's say I'm standing here, the lightsaber is at my head height. It wants to detect for the player, so it has to go down to the feet level. And then once it finds the player, then it goes back up. It changes the command position back to the lightsaber level because it has overrode the current entity of the command with the player by this point because of the as section of the command. So once it goes back to the position, it's going to go exactly to the lightsaber again. So then I could run the detection. If the score of the current entity, which is now the player, matches the nearest lightsaber, which is now the lightsaber that should be used because it went back to the lightsaber's position, and then it's detecting LCID. Then it runs a function of lightsaber give, and since we're running as the player, it actually gives the lightsaber to the player. And then again, execute position 1.5 blocks down for proper coordinates. Then it gets the player as the current entity. Then if the score matches, then we run kill the thrown saber. So now if I display the scoreboard, so scoreboard objective set display sidebar, and I go LCID, you should notice that when I throw the lightsaber, I get an ID and my lightsaber gets a matching ID. As you can see, it also disappears once I pick it up. And if I throw multiple lightsaber, when the first one comes back, my ID does not actually reset, and all subsequent lightsabers carry on the same ID score until, of course, all of them disappear and it resets back to 0. And then once I throw it again, it starts up from 1 and continues counting on. As you can see, it works perfectly fine in multiplayer. It does proper damage and throws out and returns to the correct person. And as you can see, it also works for PvP battles just fine. So a bug that I actually noticed while doing that multiplayer testing, you might have noticed it, is that the lightsaber actually gets stuck if you die while they're midair. So let me throw these out, and you'll see when I kill myself, that those lightsabers will actually be stuck floating in the air, and that's definitely not what we want. So I'm going to show you the fix that I made. It's 3 simple commands. So inside of VS Code, I have it in the fly and the return MC function. I basically have checks to make sure that there's always a player with a matching ID to the lightsaber. And if it doesn't, then I kill it. So what I do is I execute at the position of the lightsaber, and then I switch the entity of the command to all players. And then it checks if the score of the current entity, which is going to be all of the players, for the ID matches the nearest lightsaber's ID, and the nearest lightsaber's ID is going to be the one who's running the command, since that's the position. And then it runs a tag add for the tag called alive, which basically signifies that there is a player with a matching ID, and if the tag of alive is added, then it doesn't kill the lightsaber. But if it detects that there is no tag for alive on the lightsaber, then it runs the kill command to remove it. And then at the end of the tick, it removes the tag of alive so that when it comes back over here, in the next tick, it actually can try to add it back. So basically, if there's a matching player ID, it's going to add the alive tag and keep it alive. And if there's no player with the matching ID, then it's not going to add the alive tag and it's going to kill off the lightsaber. So I have this inside of fly.mc function, and I have this inside of the return MC function. And when I actually add this in, you'll see that when I throw the lightsabers, that the lightsabers actually disappeared this time. And I don't have it in my inventory because they didn't return yet, and that's why they're gone, because the commands actually worked. So that's it for today's Let's Code Lightsaber video. If you guys have any other suggestions for Let's Code topics or any feedback on the video, make sure to leave it in the description below. The datapack download is in the description if you want to play with it yourself or if you want to check out the code. I have some more videos planned. I just have to find the time to do it since I've been kind of busy with school and stuff like that. But I do have some more tutorials and some datapack challenge stuff coming up.